Advent, the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, has always been a special time for me, especially because it conjures up happy memories of home and family, of school and local church, all working together and creating an atmosphere that was almost tangible of anticipation at the coming celebrations for the birthday of our Lord. For us then and now, that birthday, like all birthdays, matters. However, I'm aware that for many people, especially those who profess to have no belief in God and want nothing to do with organised religion, Advent serves no purpose other than getting into the party mood. As folks in New Orleans would put it, laissez les bon temps rouler, let the good times roll. I was fortunate in my work as a priest to pay a yearly visit to New Orleans, to Loyola University, and to sample local culture and traditions. And I soon realised that religious roots of the Catholic tradition are deeply ingrained, and people have no problem with the secular and the sacred sitting comfortably together. And that's as it should be when you remember that Christmas is about incarnation, God choosing to become personally involved in the whole adventure of being human. And his reason? To demonstrate the truth about what it means to be fully human and to help release the potential that lies deep in every individual, though often hidden and unheeded. The letter to the Hebrews tells us in chapter 4, verse 15, that he would be tempted because of that in every way that we are, except he did not sin. Sin is an aberration. It's a failure in humanity, nothing to be proud of or to write home about. Yet you sometimes hear people excuse some serious wrongdoing with the pitiful explanation, well, I'm only human. What more do you expect from me? The message of Advent is a lot more if you're up for it. Advent is not first and foremost an attempt to make you more religious, but to help you become more human, more truly you. In fact, the best version of you that's possible. And that's God's main objective. Not to get you more involved in religious affairs or church matters. That might or it might not happen. No, he wants to get you more involved in life. What's going on and perhaps not going on in your own life and in the lives of people around you, and in fact people everywhere. That suggests that it is in the ordinariness of everyday secular life that we will experience the sacred and become aware of the presence of God. The story of the Bible spells that out for us. Do you remember the account in chapter 3 of the book of Exodus about Moses' first experience of God? It happened while he was working, looking after his father-in-law's sheep. Something caught his eye. There was a bush on fire, but it wasn't burning away, and he was curious. There was obviously more to this than met the eye, and he was right. And as he drew near to it, he heard a voice, which he thought had to be the voice of God because there was no one else there. Take off your shoes and feel the bare earth. Be at one with nature. Realize that you're standing on holy ground, and it's God's presence that makes it holy. You know, I've often thought of the burning bush as a good way of describing a saint, someone very ordinary whose life is on fire with the love of God, someone for whom nothing or no one is ever too much trouble. Saintly, holy people, whole people seem to have hidden depths of resourcefulness and energy. They're always available, and they tend to be attractive people. Do you know the poem by the Jesuit priest Gerald Manley Hopkins? It's called God's Grandeur. He wrote it in 1877 when the growth of industrialization meant that it might be possible, people would lose sight of the close connection between nature and God. And he wrote this: "The world is charged with the grandeur of God, but generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod." We've lost that link. We need to take off our shoes and reconnect with nature and with God who's all around us. And Advent is a good time, as good a time as any, to reconnect with God, to let him catch up with us. Acknowledge that he is real and not a figment of our imaginations or wishful thinking of faith. There was a birth, a life, a ministry, a death, and a resurrection, and the promise, "I will be with you till the end of time." I used to tell the school children in the parish never to write Xmas instead of Christmas. X is the cancel out sign, and there are sadly a lot of people who would like to take Christ out of Christmas and cancel any mention of him and replace Christmas with some form of pre-Christian pagan winter festival which focuses on the winter solstice in December, when the dark of the shortest day, or of the shortest day and the longest night is on the turn, and we have the beginning of more daylight. So we can understand why Christians would choose late December to commemorate the birth of Christ. They saw it as the dawning of a new day for the whole of mankind and the advent of a light, the light of the world, a light that will never be extinguished and that can shine even in the darkest moments of human life. We might well ask then, how does that work in practice? The bishops of the Church asked that very question in the 1970s when they gathered in Rome in solemn council, what we now know of as the Second Vatican Council, to bring the Church into the world of today, give it a bit of a facelift, if you like. In fact, they ended up giving the Church more of a body lift, making it more fit for purpose in all ways, in its structures and organisation, more open to the promptings of the Holy Spirit and the pursuit not of its own self-interest, but of God's best interests, which will be found in a faithful reading and interpretation of God's presence in the Scriptures and in over 2,000 years of living tradition by people of faith. In November 1964, they gave their answer in a major document which we call a constitution, known as all Roman documents are, by the first two words of the original text, which is in Latin. In this case, Lumen Gentium, which translates as the light of all peoples, a light for humanity, a light of the world. That light is Christ. How does that light become accessible to us here and now then? And the answer they gave is through the Church. There is a relationship between Christ and the Church, and the document picked up on an illustration that has been used for centuries by theologians and spiritual writers. It's the relationship between the moon and the sun. Now, since Neil Armstrong stepped out on the surface of the moon in 1969, that relationship has taken on new significance. What those astronauts found was a barren, lifeless surface dotted with craters and rocks. They actually brought samples of the rocks back with them, and we can see them in the local museum. But the most distinctive thing we associate with the moon, its light shining in the dark, they couldn't find, never mind bring back. Because of course the light of the moon isn't generated by the moon, it is the reflected light from the sun. And as the moon, with the earth in tow, orbits the sun, it waxes and wanes, reflects more or reflects less of the sun's light on the earth. I think it's a good way of grasping what the church is all about and how we can appreciate that the church can go through phases when it's throwing greater light on human issues and when it's not throwing enough light. So think of it as the moon is to the sun, so the church is to Christ. And if you examine the history of the church over the centuries up to the present day, then you will discover that things are not always as they should have been. There are barren, rocky areas and sadly evidence of sinful phases where injustices went unheeded and self-interest dictated policy, even at the highest level. And yet it is within that same history that we see the light still shine through what came to be called even the Dark Ages in the lives of ordinary people, men and women who remained in contact with God. Advent recalls the challenge that the coming of Christ, incarnation, brings. You are to be the light of the world, Jesus says in the Gospel in Matthew chapter 5. And your light must shine before others so that others may see your good works. In other words, your humanity working at its best, and give glory and praise not to yourself, that's vainglory, but to your Father in heaven. In one of his books, the writer, former priest Louis Everly, once observed dryly, "We are asked by Christ to be the light of the world, and yet most of us settle for being a bedside lamp. Maybe a bit near the bone, but true all the same." I think one of our problems with Advent is that the official readings for Advent in the church's liturgy, Sunday by Sunday, underline two comings of Christ. The first coming is past, it's behind us. It's the one that we recall in the Christmas crib, the infancy stories in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and in the various carols that we love to sing, sadly for such a brief time. The second coming is still to come. It's ahead of us at some unspecified time in the future, which we probably secretly hope is not too soon. It's the one that Matthew describes in chapter 24 of his Gospel, in the final judgment scene, when the litmus test for every one of us will be what sort of human being we were. Did we recognize God in his human face, especially the face of those who were living in hunger or pain or without freedom, lonely, unwanted, or were we too busy, self-contained? Sometimes our imagination works overtime, and that future coming, the final end of history and time, takes on an apocalyptic dimension, and we imagine all sorts of terrible things towards the end: nuclear winter, breakdown of society, chaos, oblivion, all the ingredients for a Hollywood disaster movie. And it's all there in the last book of the Bible, the book of the Apocalypse, which predicts the final battle that's going to take place between the faithful and the beast. 666 is its number. A cataclysmic event that will be the end of life as we know it. We don't really want to think about it, if we're honest. But you know, the Greek word apocalyptine means to draw back the veil, not on the future. It's not about predicting future events, but to draw back the veil on the present, the here and now, what's going on deep within history. And all the apocalyptic parts that we find, whether in the Old Testament or the New Testament, were written at times of great danger for God's people, when they are facing seemingly unbeatable odds. Trouble is all around them and they can see no way out, and they're tempted to despair. That's precisely when apocalyptic writers draw back the veil and show us what's going on below the surface, as it were, and they reveal the truth of the struggle for survival, the struggle between good and evil, life and death, that has been going on throughout the whole of history. But the message of Apocalyptic is that God has the upper hand. Victory is assured. Just trust and take heart and keep going and do not fear. When we turn to the New Testament and to that last book of the Bible, the book of the Apocalypse, it's also known as the book of Revelation, for it's the unveiling of the truth about what ultimately human history is all about. One of my favourite books of all time is a little volume by the Swiss theologian, a Jesuit, Hans Urs von Balthasar. It's quite a mouthful. It was first published in 1958. And he says, in that book of Revelation, we are given a picture of the faithful locked in battle with the powers of world history. It's the battle between Jerusalem and Babylon, traditional symbols for God's people, Jerusalem, and the world's people, Babylon. And he writes this: what is portrayed as an external battle between the church and the beast is ultimately only the outward echo of a battle that is far more essential. Indeed, it's the one crucial battle, and it is fought now within the womb of the church. It is the ultimate truth of history. It is the struggle, the Lord wrestling as a lover with his bride, the church, to keep his beloved available to God and to God's purpose. And so he goes on. It's not the battle between Jerusalem and Babylon that's important for history. It is the Babylon within each one of us, which we must throw to the ground at whatever cost. The Babylon within us, the bit of us that we prefer to keep to ourselves and not make available to God. So we don't want God to enter and clear out what needs clearing out. And that's the bit that Advent invites us to face up to let God reveal the truth to ourselves and to him now at this present stage of our lives. I think it's good to be reminded, as the Benedictine nun Maria Boulding does in her classic book, The Coming of God, which I absolutely love, that the early fathers of the church actually spoke about another third coming, another approach of God, the discreet, sacramental, day-by-day coming of God into our ordinary daily routines, courtesy of all sorts of people and events and circumstances, which actually provide us with an opportunity of letting the dear Christ enter in, as we sing in the carol, Little Town of Bethlehem. And she quotes in that book from an Advent sermon of the 12th century abbot of a Cistercian abbey of Igny near Reims in France, Abbot Guéric. And he said this: between the two comings of his, the first and the final, the Lord often visits each one of us in accordance with our merits and desires. His purpose is to form us to the likeness of him in his first coming in the flesh, and to prepare us for his return at the end of time in the last coming. And so he goes on to explain why God thinks that's a good thing. He comes to us to make sure that his first coming shall not have been a waste of time, and that his last coming may not have to be in anger. In other words, God waits and watches for any opportunity to get through to us, keep us attuned. In my hometown of Bathgate, where I grew up, there is a large mosaic above the high altar, and it shows the face of Jesus with one finger raised as if to say, "Do you have a minute?" My mother would take me into the church and she would say to me, "Now look and remember, God is always watching you." Now for years those words hung over me like the words in George Orwell's book 1984, "Big Brother is watching you," kind of ominous and threatening. And looking back, I don't doubt that there were times in my life when those words came to mind and probably helped keep me out of trouble. But later on, someone opened my understanding to a deeper meaning. When you really love someone, you find you can't take your eyes off them. You parents and lovers will no doubt testify to the truth of that. And that's why God constantly waits and watches. He wants us to know how much he loves us, but he will not force himself on us. He'll bide his time, choose his moments, and that's our starting point for making good use of this time of Advent, of letting God know he's welcome. The old Scottish Catechism asked the question, "Where is God?" And it gave the answer, "God is everywhere." Very simple. But that simple answer can present a problem. If God is everywhere in general and nowhere in particular, then it becomes possible to miss him. As the scriptures say, to have eyes and not see, and ears and not hear. The result is nothing happens, nothing changes. So I prefer the answer that I came across years ago by an old Jewish rabbi. God, he said, when he was asked that question, where is God? God is where we let him through. In other words, we have to cooperate. Be ready to detect the signs of his approach and be quick to respond. You may be familiar with the famous painting by Holman Hunt in the 1870s called Christ, the Light of the World, where Christ is shown standing outside a closed door in the dark, surrounded by heavy undergrowth, and he's carrying a lantern, waiting to get in, but there's no handle on the outside of the door. So he's waiting for the door to be opened from the inside. Advent invites us to do just that. Open up from the inside. Let God in. He's waiting. Traditionally, we've tended to think of Advent in terms of us waiting for God, but it might be helpful to think of it more as God waiting for us. And the evidence of the scriptures and our own experiences that God has had a long wait and still has a long wait at times. Already the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, tells us that things were originally meant to be good. And the opening words of the original Hebrew for the very first book, Bereshith bara Elohim, were translated when the Bible came to be translated into Latin with the words in principio. In principio, it does mean in the beginning, but it can also mean in principle. In principle, this is the story of what the relationship between God and humanity was to be about. And chapter 3 goes on to describe how in principle God and humanity did have and were meant to have an easy relationship, to be comfortable in each other's company. So we're told God would come down in the cool of the evening, and together they would enjoy the good things that the Garden of Eden had to offer. But then, tragically, the relationship broke down. The couple stepped over the mark, and the result was they felt an unease at the prospect of God's next visit, of him coming and seeing them in their disorder and shame, to find them now naked, exposed. That unease would harden and develop into a disease, and that's how the story describes sin. It's a final breakdown and a resulting lockdown for each of us in our humanity. And sin spreads and causes fear and distrust and creates distance. So when God did next approach, the couple were nowhere to be found. "Where are you?" God called, and he waited and there was no answer. And Genesis said the couple, humanity, hid so that God wouldn't see them. But in reality, it was so that they wouldn't have to see God. And soon the rest of the story of the Old Testament into the New Testament would turn that into the refrain, man cannot look upon the face of God and live. It was as though God was the baddie, God was to blame, and the best thing was to keep him at arm's length, avoid him as best you can. Nothing, of course, could have been further from the truth. But of course, bad news, gossip spreads quickly, and God gained the reputation of being hard and demanding. But the truth will always come out, and it would take a long time maybe before balance would be restored. God would always stay involved in his creation and in the drama of restoration, but discreetly directing things from behind the scenes, as it were. He found himself at times having to work with characters who weren't always cooperative or responsive to his guidance, willing to listen and learn. There's an old Portuguese proverb, I'm told, that says, God writes straight, but in crooked lines. In other words, it might take God a bit of weaving and dodging to accommodate us, but God will get there in the long run. So eventually, God decided the time was right for him to step in personally and play the part of the leading man himself in the person of Jesus. As the letter to the Hebrews says in chapter 5, verse 9, although he was Son, Christ learned to obey through suffering, but having been made perfect, he became for all who obey him the source of eternal salvation. Jesus showed us what being fully human is, and he offers now to help us realize that for ourselves and to discover the challenge and the joy that comes from being fully human, letting Christ in. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, at the beginning of the 20th century, who didn't believe in God, cynically remarked that hell is other people, because other people make demands on us. They get into our space, they threaten to restrict our personal freedoms. St. Matthew's description of the final reckoning for humanity, the final judgment, gives the lie to that. When the truth finally comes out, we will be judged on whether we were prepared to let Christ identify himself and get through to us in the brokenness and loneliness of the real people around us. For Matthew, heaven is other people, or at least they provide us with a sure way to heaven. And St. John would say the same in his first letter, chapter 4. How can you say you love God when you whom you cannot see, when you do not love the brother or sister whom you do see? Advent is a timely reminder that God is waiting for us to open the door and welcome him and all who share his humanity into our living and loving. In the second part, I'll suggest 3 simple, actual ways of getting into the spirit of Advent and making room for God. See you then.